Jazakumullah khairan, and thank you so much for this really inspiring words and beautiful lecture. I really related to many things that you've been mentioning, and one of the questions that came to my mind, there must have been something coming from your Islamic upbringing and Islamic studies back then that made you meet on grounds with Nelson Mandela. So if you want to share with us some of these values and ideals that you learned from Islam that made you meet with him and made you like have similar ideals and similar values. What are these values and ideals that brought you close to such a great person? And the other part of the question is, what's your advice in terms of the practical steps that we Muslims in Charleston would do to reach the goal that you set tonight? Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. When I saw the Imam raise his hand, I was very afraid because I'm just trying my luck here. And as the Fikr principle is, when there is water, then tayammum is batil. So let me say that the Muslim community of Cape Town came to South Africa about 300 years ago, 350 years ago now, against their will. They were political exiles in Java, Indonesia, and later they were brought as slaves to Cape Town. For 1.5 centuries, Islam was a banned religion. If you were caught practicing Islam, depending on what you were doing, you could be jailed, your property confiscated, or executed. The first Quran that was in written form in South Africa was written from the memory of a Hufaz, from someone who had memorized the Quran and then wrote it down. And that is still in the oldest mosque in South Africa. You know, Imam Juwayni, one of the classical scholars of Islam, in his book Al-Hayath, writes that if hypothetically, just say for example, the scholarship of Islam, those who wrote the books of Fikr and so forth, if those books were all for some reason to disappear, he felt confident that if you knew the Quran and you knew the Sunnah, the prophetic tradition, that you could reconstruct your practice of Islam from its maqasid, from its objectives and from its intents and from its values. I almost think that that's what happened in South Africa. When we didn't have the books of Imam Shafi and the books of Imam Abu Hanifa and the books of Ibn Taymiyyah and all of those kind of things, there was only 2 questions we asked ourselves throughout the difficult years. What would Allah want us to do here? And if the Prophet was here, what would he tell us to do? And then you could only really imagine good things that you must do, valuable things that you must do. And so I think that what we were able to do is to reconnect with those values. Nelson Mandela, in his book Long Walk to Freedom, writes that when they were on Robben Island, he was once allowed to walk around on Robben Island and then discovered this Muslim-looking structure. And it was the grave of Sheikh Matura, one of the old exiles from Indonesia. And then Nelson Mandela says, I realized that I was not the first prisoner on Robben Island, but the first prisoner was in fact this Muslim sheikh. And then he realized that there were people fighting for freedom long before he was born. And they were Muslim also. And then he speaks about how at moments when he was most depressed about his 27 years in prison, he would go to the qabr. He would go to the grave of Sheikh Matura and just reflect there. It helped a lot that the Muslims who visited also left some biryani behind. And he said that that was where he learned his love for biryani. And so that is the one thing. When Nelson Mandela was released, I had the privilege of taking him from the boat, because the first thing he wanted to do was to visit the oldest masjid in Cape Town on the Friday afternoon for Jumu'ah. Then the night go to the oldest synagogue in Cape Town, and then the Sunday morning go to the church in Soweto. So his first thing was to go to all these different places. And so this relationship grew. It also was that the Muslims of South Africa had followed their instincts for good and for justice. And so everyone knows that Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years. Very few people know that for 26 of the 27 years in the cell right next to him was Ahmed Kathrada, sentenced along with Nelson Mandela to life in prison. Everyone knows Steve Biko was tortured to death in apartheid prisons. Very few people know that Imam Abdullah Harun, the Imam of the Claremont Mosque, was similarly tortured to death for his beliefs. And so, and this comes to the practical advice. I'm not saying that you should be tortured to death or anything like that, or be life imprisoned for your beliefs or whatever the case. That's not it. You are very fortunate, alhamdulillah, that that is not what the Ummah is asking of you. But the lesson that I think South Africa teaches, why it was that when Nelson Mandela appointed his first cabinet in 1994 after South Africa's freedom, South Africans were surprised that he selected 9 Muslims to be in his cabinet, including the Minister of Constitutional Development, Water Affairs, and the First Minister of Justice. The first Chief Justice he appointed was Justice Ismail Muhammad. Why? Because we had not stood aside when fellow South Africans were being oppressed. We joined them because we realized that the best way to fight Islamophobia was to fight racism against blacks. Sometimes we become obsessed with our own battles and we don't see it as a similar battle that we are fighting for discrimination against us. The source of racism is ignorance and fear, prejudice and discrimination. The source of Islamophobia is ignorance and fear, prejudice and discrimination. The source of anti-Semitism is ignorance and fear, prejudice and discrimination. They all have the same parents. They are brothers and sisters of each other. And therefore you can't choose that I just want to fight the brother called Islamophobia. Because then people don't see you as fighting a credible fight. They see you as fighting for your own interests. Whereas if you show that you had a moral interest, that when Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson, Missouri, that your voice should be as loud as when the Chapel Hill 3 were killed. Because if you don't do that, your bona fides will always be questioned. And that when there's oppression in a Muslim country, and there's oppression and there's a genocide in Rwanda, you've got to be against genocides per se, and not your own choice of genocides. And so the most important lesson is consistency. What you love for yourself, you must love for others, and what you hate for yourself, you must hate for others. And sometimes it is better to fight others' battles, and then they will fight your battle.
Ambassador Rasool, first let me just say this, that is one of the most beautiful speeches I have heard. This is a speech that should be given to every Muslim community and also to the members of the Republican primary. Really, we are honored. We are honored to listen to you.
I'm taking it out of my heart. That's okay.
We are honored, really honored to listen to your words. Before I get to my question, I just want to tell you that I, for one, I'm fascinated by your country's history, and I followed it from the Boer Wars to the de Klerk areas. I followed it with the sporting isolation, the Basil de Oliveira affair. I followed it to the opening of South Africa, the opening of democracy, to the Rainbow Nation, and it is a fascinating country. And the way the minorities have succeeded there, and Muslims in particular, is absolutely fascinating. My question to you is, on one hand, South Africa has done a superb job of not falling into the trap of Zimbabwe or Uganda. And for that, you people are really to be commended to the furthest extent possible. Yet at the same time, Johannesburg probably is the most scariest city on the planet. So if you could explain to us your successes in not falling into the trap of another Uganda, and also how can we stop some of the violence that is taking place in some of the bigger cities in South Africa? Thank you.
So thank you very much. The question is basically that South Africa has some very unique achievements, that it has chosen not to go the way of, say, Zimbabwe, and with policies and so forth that may be short-sighted. But at the same time, we have deep problems like crime and violence in cities like Johannesburg, and how do I respond to those two? Let me first say very quickly about this primary candidate without getting political about it. I don't see Trump as a problem, I see him as an opportunity. I think that in his candidature, he is asking every American to examine who they are, what they stand for, what are their finest values, and were he to be the Republican candidate, I think he could forge a lot more unity in opposition to him of right-thinking people saying, that's not us. But again, it's not going to happen magically. It is going to come when people against Islamophobia connect with Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter connect with other African Americans, the civil rights, and people all come up and say, this election is actually a referendum about our identity and our values, and let's make it such. And that, I think, is maybe an opportunity that is waiting to happen. That's the way in which we forged a South African identity out of the evil of apartheid, although I don't think Trump is at that level at all. About the question about South Africa, there's a massive debate after 20 years in South Africa about whether the leadership of Nelson Mandela may not have led to some of the problems that we are still facing today. My short response to that is that had we not taken those lessons, we would not have a fighting chance in the world. The second thing is that when the Bible says that man shall not live by bread alone, then maybe we've been focusing so much on the bread and butter issues. We've built 5 million houses. We've gotten electricity to 90% of our population. 100% of children who must be in primary school are in primary school, and so forth and so forth. So we've got enormous quantitative gains in South Africa. We've got some of the best laws. I think even our Constitution has learned from the weaknesses of the US Constitution and built on it. We've got socioeconomic rights. We say, unlike the US Constitution, we are each other's keepers, and so forth and so forth. So I think we've got some really amazing achievements. But we may have been very good at our political transformation. We may have been really good about our social transformation, about economic transformation, even despite enormous shortcomings. But I think that the one thing that we must learn, and this is really important, it's going to challenge the Palestinians, it's going to challenge the Syrians after this enormous setback that they've had, it's going to challenge Iraq continuously, etc., is that there must be a spiritual transformation as well. We've got to find ways of even doing mass therapy, because you can't have been subjected to such intense level of trauma and violence, and then when Nelson Mandela is elected president, you're suddenly all okay. Because the violence is becoming generational. The trauma has not been removed from the first generation victims, people who faced the tear gas, who saw people being butchered, and became immune to the idea of seeing someone die next to them. It's almost become so every day that when life doesn't matter to you anymore, then taking life doesn't matter to you. And so we are shocked ourselves that a robbery becomes a violent robbery. Because we have just grown so used to life being cheap. And so we need, in South Africa particularly, ways in which we can remake our relationships. I think that women in South Africa face their own challenges. Because sometimes when you as the man is so emasculated, sometimes the only power you exercise is over your family and your spouse. And so we need, and so every society, before it makes the choice to get deeper into violence, needs to ask itself, how will we extract the violence? How will we remove the gene for violence after 10 years of war, after 5 years of a genocide, after seeing 250,000 people die, after seeing 68 years since the Nakba, etc., etc. How will we reconstitute the soul of our people? And therefore, the Quran is very clear, even when it gives permission to Muslims to fight. It says, but if they incline to peace, then you too incline to peace. Because it knows that you can win a war, but you cannot easily reconstitute a soul. And I think that really we can answer the question with more police, with wall-to-wall cameras that's going up, but we are increasing the policing, but we are not cutting the source of the inflicted trauma that I think is happening in places like South Africa.